It looks like people are still coming in, but I'm going to admit them as I go along because we want to be mindful of the time. And I'd like to welcome you. I'm Gina Zanellini Morrison from the Division of Global Cultures at Wilkes University. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the third and the last in our series of global conversations presented to you by Global Cultures program at Wilkes. Before I present today's speaker, I'd like to remind you that this session is being recorded for educational purposes. So kindly mute yourself for now and find the chat button where you can post your questions at any time, which will be answered later. Our guest today will speak for about 45 minutes or so, followed by the Q&A portion of the session. But now, let me see if there's anybody else to come in. We're doing fine. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, women's rights activist Umyra Ahmad. I'm going to try to spotlight her for you so you can be sure that you can see her. And she's going to talk to you today about global feminist advocacy. She has asked me to let you know that she'll speak from her own experiences and her own perspectives on women's advocacy rather than as the representative of her organization. Born in Malaysia, Ms. Ahmad studied international law in the UK and has since been very involved with her work in human rights advocacy and social justice. She is now a coordinator with the international feminist advocacy organization called AWID, the Association for Women's Rights and Development, based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. But she is zooming in tonight from Southwest France. It's about 11:30 p.m. over there, so we really appreciate her flexibility. Ms. Ahmad is truly a global person. She speaks 4 languages and is active in the feminist movement building in national, regional, and international contexts. I met her, I think about a decade ago in Malaysia while I was on sabbatical there. But the last time I actually saw her in person was on election day in Malaysia, 2018, which was a day full of electricity and sweeping change in that country. I saw then what a passionate advocate for social rights she had become. And I feel so lucky that we are able to bring her to our community tonight. So I'm happy to present to you Umyra Ahmad. Thank you for coming, Myra.
Thanks so much, Gina, for having me. And thanks everyone for actually making the time to be. I can imagine, you know, the pandemic is an easy time and it isn't really easy to, be present and engage in the ways that we used to be. So I think it's really great that everyone's here and I really appreciate it. And also thanks to Gina for inviting me. I'd just like to give a quick outline of what I'd be talking about today. And I hope I can make the 45 minutes. I usually talk a lot, but 45 minutes is also a lot of time. So I'll really try my best. So as Gina mentioned, my name is Umyra Ahmad, and I'm actually, I was born in Malaysia and I actually lived there. I work for a feminist movement organization, and I'll try to explain a bit more what that is because it's a mouthful and you don't really, nobody really knows what it is. And I honestly struggle as well to explain to people what it is exactly that I do, but I'll try my best to do it today. Try to give some key components about the work that I do, how I do it, where I do it, and who I work with, and also some principles behind how I work. And through that as well, give some personal background to my own personal experience, my education, and I also understand everybody here is trying to figure out where they're going after this. And so hopefully I could speak a bit more to my own journey in that respect as well. I'll also share a bit more about my journey through social justice and specifically feminist advocacy. And I hope that it'll be enlightening for you. And I think I've said this to Gina, like it'd be great if we could maybe, if you have any questions that you want to write in the chat, I'm happy to do that. And I might post some questions as well, more generally in the chat. So feel free to like interact. And I have to admit, I'm like not an expert in pedagogy, so I'll do my best. Yeah. So the organization I work with is called AWID, and in the social justice sector and the NGO world, acronyms are such a huge thing, and I really wish it wasn't that way because it feels quite inaccessible sometimes, especially with the jargon. But I've been in this role for about a year and a half, and the crux of my work is, in very general terms, resisting fundamentalisms and fascisms in the UN. And what does that mean? It sounds very superfluous and it's huge, and I'm not expecting anybody to really understand what it means. But basically, my work is to kind of push back, debunk, expose actors or, kind of people in the UN that are trying to undermine gender rights, sexuality rights, gender being, rights related to gender identity, gender expression, and also sexuality rights and sexual orientation. So why is this work important? And why did I feel it was important? And I think, especially coming from not just the US context, but also Malaysia, we've made strides in the past how many years of really pushing forward for gender equality, and also, I'll say sexual rights, meaning gender identity and also sexual orientation. But at the same time, we're seeing such a huge pushback. And this is something that the feminist movement really identified as a big, big challenge to our work. And I'll get more into what the UN is. What is the UN? What is human rights? And maybe some of you have already covered this in your work itself. But the UN traditionally is supposed to be a fora where countries come together to decide on issues in a multilateral way, multilateral being in an agreement. And I think perhaps you've talked to other kind of presenters that also work within this kind of system. But the system that I work within the UN is really looking at agreements on human rights that countries have agreed together in an intergovernmental way. So historically, this UN system was kind of created after World War II, recognizing all the atrocities to say never again, basically. And so it enshrined a principle of rights, which essentially means that you are able to claim certain entitlements or rights on the basis that you're human. And so the UN human rights system is a fora where countries come together to agree on certain rights, to advocate for rights. And you have actors such as myself, who is civil society representative. We are supposed to represent the people. And we can talk a bit more about that later. And try to ensure that rights progress in the right direction. So what are these kind of anti-rights actors doing? Or you can call them fundamentalist and fascist, so to speak. Essentially what they are doing right now is they are manipulating arguments of religion, culture, tradition, to really undermine the rights that we have now. And I think this is happening everywhere. So for example, one very clear thing that I see in the US, because I follow US politics a lot, and who doesn't, is this example that my right to say a racist comment, for example, is undermining my freedom of speech. And these are the kind of arguments that are really being used by actors that are conservative, Christian conservative, Muslim conservative, very nationalist kind of parties who are within this system, and they're trying to put these arguments forward. And we identify this as a very dangerous thing, not only because it's going back from the rights that have already been established, but it's also trying to create a parallel human rights system that is completely non-rights based. So we can see, for example, we have politicians such as Trump and Bolsonaro who really try to push for this kind of ideology. And so what we really try to do is to combat that, to challenge that, to be in these UN spaces and say, hey, that's not right. You can't do that. And that you have to go back to the human rights principles. Another example of arguments that are being used, and please, I'm aware that I might be using some jargon, And this is another reason why I understand the UN is completely inaccessible, because it's this kind of language that perhaps isn't, like, you kind of know what it means, but at the same time, because it's streamlined into a specific fora, it looks different. So another example is nationalism. You have no right to tell me what to do because I am a sovereign state. And I think this is one of the most favorite arguments of all of states when it comes to human rights. And for example, you have human rights convention that looks at discrimination based on gender. You have human rights treaties where countries have agreed to sign on to ensure that there's no discrimination based on race and all of these things. So for example, interestingly enough, the US hasn't signed up to any of those. And Malaysia, for example, refuses to sign up to the one on race because of our background. So it's quite interesting to work in this kind of space because it's really everything that you see around you in your everyday news, in your everyday life. You can really see it play out in this fora. So that's one part of it. Another part of work that I do is really looking at supporting social movements. And social movements, are folks familiar with this kind of terminology, social movements, what that means? Okay, so that's great. So what we really try to do is we identify areas that we think social movements need support, and not just us identifying, but also social movements coming to us and saying that, hey, this is a really important issue that we need to work on. And for us, it's to ask back, like, okay, what do you really need? And when we say that we're a global organization, what this really means is not necessarily us being the experts and training people on the ground. What it actually means is how can we support you as a global organization to connect together? So one clear example that I really find really inspiring is the abolish the police movement that's happening in the US. And I think this is really drawing attention to the kind of, violence that is going on. And what happened in Malaysia, for example, is that on Twitter, on the news, people started picking this up. And they're like, hey, actually, this is happening in my country too. And so for us, we see these kind of connections as a real opportunity to really dig into the human rights issues that are happening on the ground and regionally as well. So another example of groups that I work with, social movements that are quite popular right now in terms of fundamentalisms is we work with a group called Sisters in Islam in Malaysia. And they have a very interesting perspective of trying to take back the Quran in order to interpret it from a feminist point of view. And what does that mean? It means that having family laws or advocating for family laws that are much more equal, that are based on the right to access economies for both men and women. And so this kind of social movement in Malaysia, what happened was that they recognized that, oh wait, we see the same thing happening in Tunisia. We see the same thing happening in other countries and these contexts. So how can we actually work together and exchange strategies and also drive each other's change in a more positive and strategic way? And so really the work that I do, I hope it makes sense at this point, but it's really to hone into these strengths of the different movements and also trying to bring them to an international forum. One thing that I like to highlight, or I'd really like to touch upon, is this concept of the global. And I think this is a really interesting, I think when Gina invited me, she was talking about global cultures, and it really got me thinking about what's the global actually in this current moment, where it seems like I have access to you, you have access to me, and what's going on in the US, what's going on in Malaysia, what's going on in Thailand, what's going on in Mali has a domino effect to each other. So how can we really kind of alienate the local from the global? And that's something that I've also been grappling with as I work with this in this organization, is that how do we as global advocates, or my job specifically, make sure that the work that I'm doing actually gets to the ground? Because there's so much sometimes, and I'm being very candid, so much fluff sometimes going up in policy spaces that it never actually gets the people who are talked about the most. So I think as I work through the things that I do, and the more that I've worked in this sector, I think I've learned from so many amazing feminists and social justice activists who really try to ground themselves in these in certain principles that actually help them guide through their work. And for example, one of them is equality. And equality isn't just formal, but it's also real equality. This also means being aware of power dynamics and also histories of oppression. So for example, myself being educated in the UK, speaking very well, being able to talk about human rights is not necessarily going to relate with someone in Malaysia who's from the rural area. And so being aware of these power dynamics and how also I can shape policy, also through excluding the rural woman in Malaysia, something that is really, really important to acknowledge as we do this work. And another thing that we've also been thinking a lot about, and something that I try to stand by, is in the feminist spaces, we have this saying, nothing about us without us. And what does that actually mean? In human rights spaces, I have to admit, sometimes things can be a bit hypocritical. It's to say that, okay, you know, we are fighting for the rights of the marginalized, we are fighting for the rights of this and that person, but at the same time, that person is never actually at the table. So you have to ask yourself sometimes, like, what does this actually mean? I say that I'm fighting for, and this happens often, I'm fighting for the rights of a poor woman in Morocco. But this woman in Morocco is nowhere to be seen at the table. So how do I actually reflect on my own practice to say that, hey, something's wrong here, you know? And another thing as well that is a big part of our work is thinking about feminist ways of working, which also means having real representation, thinking about ways to strengthen that. So it's been a real journey for me, and I like to think of myself as still quite young. And I think it's only the first part of my, for the past 6 years, I've been working on this. And I think working in the social justice kind of environment is friendly at the same, not friendly, it's great, but at the same time, there's also risk that I see, for example, where this kind of work starts to behave like companies instead, where things that are supposed to be about social justice ends up being about not necessarily profit, but capital in different ways. It becomes about prestige, it becomes about all of this. And one thing that I found really important in this work is standing by the principles that I talked about just now: equality, nothing about us without us, all these kind of different things. So that's the complexities of the industry itself that I won't go more into. But yeah, I just wanted to ask whether that was clear, or if you have any questions, again, please feel free to write in the chat. So next, I think I'll go more a bit into my own personal journey of from being a student to actually working here right now. So I did a degree in the UK, which I'm aware is very different from the US. I think I also find it really interesting because in the US, for example, a law degree is a postgraduate, right? It's not a first degree. But for me, I did a law degree as a first degree. And it's a bit complicated because originally this is not what I really wanted to do. And of course, you have some stereotypes about Asian parents wanting you to always do a professional degree. And for the longest time, I resented that. But at the same time, it makes sense economically as well, because I think they came from a generation where this is what security looked like. And so they assumed that for their children as well. So I wanted to do something like sociology or literature, but I chose to do law at the end. And I think it's quite interesting because, and this is a side note, but also very interesting, is that I realize as well as there are more and more law graduates in Malaysia, there's less jobs. And it really makes me think about this, you know, this kind of thought that, or illusion I had when I was younger, oh, you know, with these qualifications, I'll for sure have a better job and things like that. So there's some degree of truth to that, but I also like wanted to share my own personal experience through learning law in a UK university was that I struggled quite a bit because I couldn't really relate to the content that was in front of me. It was very difficult for me to understand at 18 when I took a degree that, okay, this is, you know, I have to understand contracts. I have to understand wills. I didn't understand will, like I'm 18, like what do wills mean? You know, like what does it actually mean? And so I think that also encouraged me to go more into the social science aspect of law, which actually asks questions about why is the law the way it is? Just because the law doesn't mean that it's correct. And so after doing that, I realized, okay, then more into human rights law. And at the same time, I was kind of trying to sit with my own discomfort of, but will this actually secure my livelihood? Because I hear that human rights work doesn't pay well. But at the same time, this is also a personal antidote that I was working in law firm and I was working on a case that it was really strange. It was about a shareholder dispute. And they were basically saying that I'm not happy with having maybe $4 million. I want $7 million. And I remember sitting there thinking, yeah, I feel a bit weird. Like, I don't think this person needs more money. I kind of became the judge of that myself. But having said that, I think I had the privilege to kind of reflect on what I really wanted to do and also kind of carve my own journey. And through that, I kind of became active in local activism in the small ways that I could. I tried to support, for example, migrant rights NGOs. I tried to support women's rights organizing and all of that. And I was lucky enough to, after a bit of that, get into an organization that was looking at women's rights, but in the context of the Asia Pacific region. And so I naturally gravitated towards something that I felt most affected by, which was gender equality. And at that time, I think it was also relating to my own personal experience of what I felt was discrimination, but I didn't really know how to articulate it. So when I saw these kind of causes, I was like, okay, I can identify with that. And maybe if I go more into this, it's something I'd be really interested in. And I'm sure you can relate to it as you see injustice all around you. You have a certain feeling, right? You know something's not right, you know something is off, but you don't really necessarily know what to do about it. It could be in your everyday life, it could be within family interactions, it could be in more formal lenses all around you when you read the news, you know? It's the small things, it's the big things. So at the same time as, sorry, something fell. So at the same time, I started my work, like I said, working in the regional organization. I remember also doing work from doing a lot of capacity building work, which basically means education, giving women in certain countries information about their rights and all of that. And in all honesty, it was in countries that were found to be less developed, so to speak. But I think I also had a bit of a moment of epiphany there, because the way that these things work sometimes is that it's really top down. So you have people who are experts with knowledge, often people like me, and then you have the knowledge receiver. And I remember going to train some woman in Papua New Guinea, and it clicked for me that my approach might have been wrong all along. It's not that they have less capacity or they have less ability, but it's really because they have less access, and also because of the inequality that's created by global systems. And we have Malaysian companies who are logging in Papua New Guinea and actually contributing to, you know, the destruction of livelihoods of the women in Papua New Guinea. So I remember thinking to myself, okay, I'm here to train them to claim their rights, but at the same time, my own country is contributing to the oppression that they face. So how do I kind of sit with that. Like, what's my role then as a feminist organizers who is really invested in looking at systems of oppression? And so that's one example. And another example that I'd like to share was that I started my kind of career looking at women's empowerment and gender-based violence. And I think one thing that I really learned from here is that there's a big silo between understanding women's rights as something that's standing alone. So we think of women's rights or, LGBTIQ rights or racial justice as something that's kind of separate from more bigger things like the economy, climate change, but it's really not. So for example, when we think about GDP and gross domestic product, it's based on certain notions of what's valued within our economy, right? It invisibilizes other forms of work, such as domestic work and care work. So the formal economy in reality couldn't work at all if nobody was looking after children at home or providing care to the elderly, which is usually within the domain of women's labor. And what is this fair in the current economy as it stands? And in Malaysia, for example, we are constantly encouraging women to climb up the corporate ladder. But at the same time, we are not having any policies at all that is about childcare, that is about elderly care. And what happens in Malaysia, you have a big influx of migrant workers who are paid very badly, who have very little labor rights, don't even have a weekend off. And you end up marginalizing someone else. So I'm on a big ramble now, but I think point I'm really trying to make is that social justice issues are really interconnected with one another, and you can't really fight one another. And so for me, it was really an eye-opening experience to kind of think about myself and say like, okay, where do I sit within all of this? Because I really thought at the start, feminism was all about gender. It's just about being a woman, that's it. But we all know this approach isn't realistic because gender is one aspect of our identity. It's not all of it. So you, for example, have, I think, a very famous Black feminist called Audre Lorde, who said, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So for example, for me, I'm a woman living in Malaysia, and at the same time, I have certain privileges of the fact that I can actually have access to higher education. There are some racial issues in Malaysia that make me in a better position than someone of another race. And so for me, why I found this work really exciting and really interesting was because it really challenged my own point of view about myself, about power dynamics. And it also gave me a real way to understand how to look at the world and how to really treat other people. I think that's a really important point. And I think it's a really interesting thing because I'm also still trying to figure out my journey through this activism, and I'm currently working at the global level, and sometimes I feel like, is this the right thing for me to do? Should I go home and really work at the local level? Am I more impactful there? And what does it mean to be at the global level while also being active locally? So I still try to, as much as I can, support local activism. I'm still involved in a few LGBTIQ kind of advocacy cases locally, which means that I try to support lawyers in filing cases against imprisonment of LGBTIQ people. We also try to run donation drives for migrants in Malaysia or refugees in Malaysia who have no way of accessing livelihoods or even having education. And for me, I think these two things really bridge my own knowledge about how I'm functioning at the global level, because it also keeps me grounded. And so I think I'm really scared, like I have tons of time left. But I think one thing that I think also through these, and I'm sure like also social justice language has become very popular in popular culture nowadays, right? Like it's almost accessible to everyone. And, you know, and I can imagine like it's quite difficult to navigate through all these different terminologies and, you know, and I think like, I'm not sure how old everyone is here, but like I said, I think I'm young. And I have a younger sister who has so much access to all these different kind of information. So I think it's really important to also keep grounded as you're thinking globally as well, because like I said, the global and the local is really connected and you can't really think about things separately. What else was I about to say? I think I didn't talk enough about this, but also how my own identity as a Malaysian has shaped the way that I see the world or the work that I do is Malaysia is, I don't know if folks know that much about Malaysia and what it is. We are a bit like the US in some very interesting ways where we are multicultural. That means that our history of the country has been an amalgamation of the push and pull of migration between countries. And we're also a British colony, and we're a part of a big regional history that has experienced quite a lot of colonization. And my mother, for example, her family is originally an immigrant from Indonesia. And my father's side is also similarly his father is Thai, his mother is Indian. And so I don't think I really recognize how much of that would actually inform the way that I did my work, but it really has, and it really makes me think that, makes me question this thing again, like what does it mean to be global? What does it mean to be local, especially at this time is when we have, and it's always been like this, to be honest. I know I say now, but people have been migrating since the beginning of time. And so, yeah, that's my own personal rambling reflection. But I think a few takeaways that I'd really love to like hone in is that I think it's really important, like I said, as we work with the global and the local, to be really aware of your own power and where you sit in the room. I think it's super important to know where you stand, to know, you know, things are not black and white, things are very layered. And as you go global, for example, I think it's really important to know the histories of the different places that you're going to, why you're going there, and really like reflect of it as like not just a career progression, but as an onward journey that's never ending, really, because there's so much to learn and there's so much histories that we don't really know about. And I think another thing I would say also, don't be afraid to critically challenge things around you, but also yourself. Like, and if you're sometimes in a position of discomfort, like kind of ask why and all of that. And I think these are like some general things that I think about as I kind of reflect on the work that I do, the positioning that we have, and also, yeah, how I can do my work better. So I think I'm about 35 minutes. I don't know, Gina, is that enough?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have so many questions already, although I don't see any in the chat yet. But just to tune in, zoom in on something that you said. You said so much of what we have just covered in our global cultures class about, you said that feeling of discomfort, and we've heard other speakers say that, and this feeling like accept it. And even in research, I've told my students what one of my mentors told me: research doesn't begin in the head, it begins in the heart or the gut, that feeling that something is wrong and I don't know what. So how am I going to figure out what it is? And what do I need to do? Or here I am along a path and I'm feeling it's not quite the right path. So I have to sit down, and then it moves up to my head, but I always have to keep that. Or another thing I tell my students is always keep your spidey senses, you know, up, because you have to tune into that. I also appreciate what you said about care work not being reflected in the GDP. And they're, you know, our books are telling us, our readings are telling us, our former guest speakers have told us that it's time for us to change the definition of a developed nation, because it's not only the GDP, GNP, it's also about how we treat our poor and how we treat each other and how we take care of social needs and how we make decisions for the betterment of all in the community. So that's actually in the chapter I will cover with them later. But it's been repeated over and over. I know I had talked to you, Umyra, about advising us on vocabulary, feminism. What it's like a real hot potato over here, to say it. You're muted. Why don't you talk to us about some words we can and can't use?
Of course. And I think there's a question from Devin. I think we can get to that later, but I trust you to moderate that, Gina, not to take the role of the moderator. But I think it's terminology is a very interesting thing. And I love it also because I'm like so tuned into social media. I love Twitter, I love Instagram, I love this hashtag cancel culture or whatever that comes up, all of this, right? And I'm really tuned into that. So it's really interesting that it's quite like feminism, for example, like you said, just start off, is considered like in some ways such a dirty word. And I think also for me, and I think feminism, it changes for everybody what it means. And I think at different points in my life as well, I understood feminism to be very different things. So at the start of my career, I thought feminism, like I said, was about women's rights, women to be equal with men. But as I moved on and I kind of learned more, feminism is really about recognizing power dynamics and kind of the fluidity and complication that flows through it as well. And it's about, like I said, knowing where you're sitting in the room and like kind of having your ears out or being aware to that. So so like, for example, I gave this very clear example that, in Malaysia, I'm a Muslim woman. That means that there are certain power dynamics there. Because I'm a woman, I really fall behind in terms of certain laws. For example, I'm not allowed to inherit certain amount, I'm not allowed to inherit as much as my brother does, for example, right? But at the same time, I'm Malay, which also means that I have advantage over other people in a way that they don't. So feminism is actually, for me, making sense of all these different power dynamics and not trying to flatten it to one thing.
That's true.
And so
why are people so negative about the word?
I think it's this discomfort. It's this thing, and I really noticed that even with any power holder, when you're forced to say like, and I think it's also a mix of this thing where people like to also believe that they are where they are because they work hard for it, because they are there but the world isn't as simple as that, right? Like, right. Of course you work hard, of course you do, but like having different identities means it. And also with women, for example, I think it's also a bit challenging to say that, I face certain discrimination that men do. But at the same time, and this is within the feminist movements, you have conversations about women who are excluding trans people because they're like, you're not woman enough. And that's also not right, because the power dynamic is not equal there. So I think there's a lot of different layers to it, but I think it's because it's challenging, because it's, because it also forces you to have a bit of a hard look at yourself and say like, okay, maybe I need to do better. So that's for me, that's what I think.
Oh, thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. And what I'd like to encourage everyone to do is I'm going to remove the spotlight. And if you would like to, everyone go up to your view and just pick gallery so we can kind of see each other. I invite you to take the camera on yourself, show your face if you're comfortable with that, and we can all have a little bit of a chat here. So I think the question is, the first one is from Devin, and Devin, there you are. Hi, do you want to unmute and ask your question yourself?
Sure. I don't know your exact age, but you seem very young and you like act young and close to our age. So I was just wondering if being a younger person affected how people like perceived you and how other people work with you when you work on these social justice issues? Like, do you ever feel like people think you're inferior or anything like that?
I think definitely. I think there's definitely elements of that. And especially the social justice world, also, you have some legendary names, right, who've like done amazing things. And of course, they're the source of knowledge. And sometimes these kind of intergenerational issues really play out as well, because it's just like, I'm the gatekeeper, I know this, I know that, and you're young, you don't really know anything, you know, and there's something wrong with the way that you do things. And I think it's such a missed opportunity because you can't really compare, right, generations. And I think like, but there is definitely that. But I think there's also another thing where I've kind of internalized that as well, where I keep saying to myself, no, I'm too young. Like, I don't know this, you know? But actually, if I actually spoke out, there might have been like a perspective that nobody else would have. And so I think it's definitely true. It does impact how people see me and I see myself. But I think it's something that feminists are trying to at least acknowledge in the current state. So yeah, that's a very good question. Hope that answers it.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Devin, for that question. Great question. We have another, and great answer, Myra. We have another question from Ryan. I think Ryan is here. Is he still here in the other room, maybe? Are you here, Ryan?
I am here.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Yeah, you're right in front of me. Would you like to ask your question to Myra directly?
Yeah, sure. So I know you mentioned earlier that it was sort of a oversimplification to view women's rights as just a separate thing, like sort of in a vacuum. So I was just wondering, like in your work or in general, what are some ways that we can promote women's empowerment alongside class and or race-based issues?
Hi, Gina. I think there's a bit of a lag with my connection.
Okay. Can you see us? Are you okay? Here. Were you able to read the question? Okay. Are you back?
Hello?
We're good. Can you
Yeah.
see us? Okay. Okay. Were you able to hear that question, Myra, or do you want me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I caught the bulk of it. It's a good question. Can everybody hear me? I feel like
We can hear you. It's a little bit choppy, but we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. It's a very good question as well. And I think for me personally, in the work that I do, it's as organizations, we really try to, number one, make sure that our organization is actually representative of the constituencies that we talked about, which is very difficult sometimes because like, okay, we want someone to work in the UN and we want someone working class, but realistically, someone who is working class doesn't have access to, you know, the education that, or the knowledge or jargon that people have in the UN. And so, for example, intentional hiring, like how do you hire people? How do you make sure that, you know, when you talk to people, you're accessible? How do you make sure that the conditions that you pose upon people aren't too strenuous? You know, it's all these different things in terms of organization. Personally, I think it's, yeah, I would say it's, how do you say this, like being an ally that is always willing, and this is, you see this everywhere in social media, the term ally, but like really willing to listen, I think, and kind of, yeah, just really willing to listen, I think is a very important way to look at it. And I'm not sure in what context you're asking this question, but yeah, feel free to ask more or clarify.
I think that,
because I might have not answered it.
That goes along with your other point about that we're not single issue people, and there, you know, we have this intersectionality in every single one of us, And you did make that point already.
Yeah.
And I think we do have to consider the whole person. And that seems to be, you know, what Ryan is asking. Not only thinking about class, race, but also you mentioned education, and so forth. And age, you know, these are all part of who we are, generation. And we all, as you say, we have capacity, but not all of us have access. So maybe it's all about access. That's a great question. Thank you. Ryan and Devin are students in my class, and currently, so I wanted to go to the next question by Jennifer Kajeski, who was one of the first student teachers I ever brought over to Malaysia, and she is now has her master's degree and is a working woman and a mother too. So Jen, I'm so glad to see you here. How are you? Would you want to ask your question yourself?
Yeah. So you talked about, you know, how when you're working on the global level, you're often wondering, you know, should you go back home and help more out on the local level? So my question for you is, what actions can we take on our local and individual levels to help these social movements progress? And based on your experience, what do you find that these movements and these organizations need assistance with most often?
Thanks, Jennifer. I think this is a bit of a context-specific one that I can't really answer in a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. But I would say the first step is just join communities that are working on something. And I personally feel that as we go into more like working mindset, we are, at least in Malaysia, we are less and less involved in, you know, kind of social movements, social activities. And I think you can always find something quite near you. And I think it takes time to find out, I think, what a community really needs and what you can do and what role you can play. But I think a real great assessment of that is really sitting down and thinking about what your own strengths are, what you can contribute, and also, like I said, the power dynamics. Where do you sit in the room, and how can you actually contribute to that? And I think there's so much. And I also wanted to say that I really think that the US is full of like historical movements that have inspired a lot of thinking globally. And you'll find very quickly that it depends on your context, but you know, different movements working on intersections of different issues. So yeah, it's a bit of a vague question, but yeah, I think it's quite context specific.
I think that Jen, that's a great question. And it just reminds me of a conversation that Myra and I had yesterday on Zoom about how we need to look around us and start there if we want global change, and connect from there. We can't go serving other distant places and come in and like we're going to save the day. You know, we have to remember that we're connected. We are grounded here. And before, isn't that the point you were making with me yesterday, Myra, about how the local is part of the global?
Exactly. And I think it's definitely the point that we talked about yesterday. And I think also working in the international field, sometimes I notice with good intentions, you can sometimes do more harm. And a lot of things with aid money, for example, that go to Africa, it doesn't really speak to how local people actually, you know, what local people actually need. And it's not to say that you shouldn't work globally. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. But I think like creating awareness around that also requires to understand your own personal history within your space, your own political and power dynamics. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. That's an awareness. I agree with you. It's really important. Thank you, Jen, for that question. And I wanted to go to our next question by Yanni Cleopolis. Yanni, you're here. You want to ask Myra your question? There.
Sure, I can ask. So you mentioned like people being hypocritical and stuff, especially people in like people in the human rights organizations in the UN and how they can be hypocrites. Are there certain ways, do you know of like maybe your organization or other organizations that they can see if they have ways of finding or I guess confronting employees who are being hypocritical? Or is there like certain tests you have to take to make sure you adhere to values, or I don't know, like how do they make sure everyone still holds true to their values on why they joined the organization 10 years down the line? And how do they make sure no one's trying to take advantage of the system?
I think that's a really great question because it's really interesting because I think also that the hypocrisy of that I was talking about was also a bit systemic. It's not necessarily grounded in one person, but it's kind of institutionalized sometimes because the way that we've learned to organize is really it's from like a company point of view where you're not necessarily working for profit, but the way that you work is as though, So for example, we're like, nobody should work nobody should work beyond certain hours, no labor exploitation. But because people are so passionate to work in this industry, a lot of, global organizations end up making people work really horrible amount of hours. So that's the hypocrisy that is a bit systemic. And I find that it happens even when you talk about race conversations, right? Like we have a lot of international NGOs that have been called out for being racist because it's not one person that makes a racist comment, but it's the fact that somebody makes a racist comment and it gets complained, but the organization is a bit like, I don't really want to deal with it. I don't feel comfortable. I don't want to do anything about it. And so when that happens, it's hard to pinpoint on whose fault it is. It's rather the system itself that doesn't have enough accountability and all these kind of different perspectives. And one thing that I really, I don't know if, of course, you've heard of her, Ruth Gilmore, who is a Black feminist activist who says like the culture of accountability is a really important one. It's a systemic one rather than just, okay, one person, because to make a place safe or good for working is a collective effort, right? And so, yeah, but that's a really, really great question. I find it really interesting.
That is.
Thank you.
That is a great one, Yanni. And sometimes organizations will sacrifice one person just to, rather than dealing with a systemic issue, which is difficult, but you have to stay at it. Great topic. Thank you. And I want to turn now to Quinn Rodfeld. Quinn is also a student in the class. Quinn, have you got a question for Myra? Would you like to ask it yourself directly? There she is.
So I just wanted to ask a question about LGBTQ rights on a global scale. What intersect?
I lost Quinn. Is she there? Can you hear her? No. She asks, she said she was very curious as to what intersections gender, politics, and religion have on LGBTQ plus rights on a global scale. Is there any way to expand on outdated mindsets and policies? And I know she's particularly interested in this, and she has a friend, a colleague from a woman from a Muslim country who was struggling, with her identity here, and she's talked to the class about it, and I'm sure it's a challenge to go from one environment to the other, and especially from certain groups. And have you got any?
Yeah.
Think about that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good one.
It's how do you put this into like it's a tough question because I think ownership over your own issues is really important, and in the sense that the ways that I found most effective to kind of challenge these kind of patriarchal ways of thinking about LGBT and intersections of religion is really, it has to kind of come from the people itself. And like I said, for example, we have sisters in Islam who really took their own kind of stage and said that this is not the Islam that I know, this is not Islam that I believe in. And so it wasn't really for someone else, or it was really powerful because it was them claiming themselves. And I'm really aware that it might be really difficult for some people in different ways, but it's a hard one. But from my point of view, my own work right now, and maybe it's easier to talk about that, it's really trying to support those progressive religious values that are actually in many pockets of society. And one thing that I find really interesting is digging into really the subcultures within different communities. And it's always there. Everybody's like, oh yeah, no, you know, he's Muslim and you can't be gay. And it's a bit like, no, that's not true. You know, and there are so many histories of resistance. And I think that's why this is where the connecting the different points of resistance is really important, because you can definitely find inspiration and to avoid taking a kind of colonial kind of taking over point of view. So I think it's this like kind of inner sort of, is super important.
Yeah, there's that intersectionality again. And that was a great question. Quinn was having trouble with her connection, but we will definitely, she's trying to get back in. As soon as I see her, I'll admit her, but thank you for answering that. And I did want to, when I saw that question, I thought about Sisters in Islam, because about the year I met you, I attended a conference in Penang, Malaysia, and they spoke at it. And I was so impressed at the way they handled themselves when questioned by, you know, certain authorities. And here comes Quinn back. I was so impressed with them, and I've kind of followed them on the website a bit. And I think they're a fantastic organization. And I was so glad you mentioned them. That's great. Thanks. I think Quinn is back with us. And Quinn, I invite you to listen, because we talked about the intersectionality of identity, and that is certainly an issue in many of these questions, actually. I have another question. So thanks, Quinn, for that. We had a little bit of a discussion while you're going. I have to fill you in. Jacob Hepta is a former colleague of mine, and he is a grad student, and he has a question. Jacob, would you like to speak directly to our guest?
Let me give it a try, make sure, because my camera wasn't working for the longest time. So hopefully you can all hear me. Let me know if you can hear me. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Gina, for inviting me. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, Umyra. I live in a very sheltered area, so it is it's great to be able to get a more global view on things. And I've been following a lot of political science lately. And I've heard about countries. I know you mentioned you were working in the UN. And I've heard about certain countries that have an authoritarian bent, and that they're trying to kind of bend and twist, say, the UN Charter and things like this on human rights. Of course, this will affect women's rights as well, in ways that would be more beneficial to them, which we would perceive as being oppressive. And I was just wondering if there were any strategies maybe to try to push back against those forces.
That's a really, it's kind of the whole scope of my work, to be honest. This is kind of the main crux of what I work at. So I think we have this thing, what it's called an inside and outside strategy, which is trying to influence the UN from the inside, and also trying to get folks to realize that this is important, and try to change mindsets of people who are actually in favor of these kinds of governments, right? And so, for example, a really interesting example, what you said about trying to erode and trying to manipulate all of this. I think when the Trump administration was in, they had this thing about a Geneva Consensus that was really looking at denying all of SRHR, which is sexual rights and health rights of women, and they're basically saying this right doesn't exist. So it's definitely there, and it's a bit of a conundrum because you don't really want to give too much attention to them. You know, you kind of want to say, you know, like, this is not the actual right that is being, you know, that is correct. Like it or not, fascisms, fundamentalisms, they have
Myra, can you, I don't know if you can hear us, but you're frozen. And if you, I think she might have left the meeting. And if she comes back in, then I hope she gets to finish. Oh, there you are, Myra.
Yeah.
You're
Can you hear
good.
me
There
now?
you are. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we can. Do you want to
Yeah,
finish
sure.
what you were saying to Jacob?
Yeah. So so one of the strategies is, like I said, working from within the UN to try to convince all these state diplomats and all of that, that, you know, this is not really human rights. And you'll be surprised about how many people have, you know, no idea about it. But it's also because the far right and all these anti-rights organizations very, very good at manipulating arguments. You can argue, for example, what was it that's like such a miss, but I can give an example of women should not have the right to decide on their sexual.
Oh, you're leaving us hanging there. Oh no, we need that word. Women should not have the right to determine their sexual. What was the rest of that sentence? Well, it looks like we might be having some technical difficulties, but I'm so happy that we got through the questions. And I always feel it's great when we have a group that several people get to talk and ask questions, and that the listener is really, I mean, the speaker is really giving a good listen to your questions and actually trying to really think about them. I have to say that for me, the takeaway today is, I love this expression, nothing about us without us, because that really says so much about inclusion, about asking people who are the center of your effort, really standing shoulder to shoulder with people rather than going in and, you know, saving the day. I love that. That's a takeaway for me. So Myra, I think we're just about at the end of our time. Unless anyone else has a question, I'm just going to turn it back to you. If you have anything else, any final thoughts you'd like to say, I'll turn it over to you if you're still on. I think you might be frozen again. And I think she might be. So I'll have to play the recording. Oh, there you go. Anything you'd like to add, Myra?
No, I'd just like to thank everyone for their questions. And I'm super excited that that I was invited here, and I'm really wishing everybody the best of luck as you go on and as you finish your course.
Well, we really appreciate everybody, you know, showing up and you listening to almost everyone here, Myra. I appreciate that you took the time out. It's like, what, 1 o'clock? What time is it? 12:30 over there now? Oh my goodness. So we better let you get some sleep. And I really do appreciate you sharing your experiences with us, particularly that you're on the earlier part of your career, which these students can really relate to that. I miss you and hope you're doing well. Everybody, thank you so much. I'm going to stay on. And if anybody would like to stay on, you're certainly welcome to stay on for a few minutes. My class is going to go take about a 5-minute break unless they want to stay on and ask you something. And then you can log back in and I'll be here. So we have a little bit of finished homework to do with the class after this. but I really appreciate everyone and the guests and everything. And thank you, Myra, for being our third and our wrap-up speaker. It's truly so meaningful. Best wishes to you in your career. Keep carrying on, do that good work. Okay, thank you everyone, and good night.
Thank you.